There is a script that avoidants have been running, in most cases, for longer than they have been running it with you. A script so deeply grooved into the architecture of their relational patterns that it operates below the level of conscious decision, below the level of deliberate strategy. In the automatic and reflexive territory of a nervous system that learned early and formatively what dynamics between people tend to look like when closeness becomes threatening and distance becomes necessary. The script has roles, it has a sequence, it has an expected progression from one beat to the next that the avoidance history has validated enough times to make it feel less like a pattern and more like the natural law of how relationships respond to their withdrawal. They pull back. The other person notices. The other person reaches. The reaching communicates need. The need communicates that the other person cannot manage without the avoidance engagement. And that communication, the visible, legible, emotionally unguarded evidence of the other person's dependency, does several things simultaneously in the avoidance interior world. It confirms that they are needed, which briefly soothes the core wound that whispers they are not worth staying for. It confirms that they hold the relational power, which soothes the fear of vulnerability by demonstrating that the other person is more exposed than they are. And it provides the specific, predictable beat of the script that allows the avoidant to know what comes next. The other person pursues. The avoidant manages the pursuit, either by allowing enough warmth to restore the dynamic to a comfortable level, or by withdrawing further, depending on what the nervous system requires in the moment. The script runs. The dynamic continues, and nothing genuinely changes because nothing genuinely needs to. The pattern is self-sustaining, the roles are filled, the sequence plays out as it always has. And then you did not beg, and the script broke. And what happened in the breaking is what this entire conversation is about. Before going into what your not begging produced, something needs to be said about what begging actually is in this context. Because the word carries a connotation of obvious desperation, of someone on their knees, literally or metaphorically, making their need for the other person maximally visible and maximally undignified. And while some versions of the pursuing behavior that avoidants wait for does reach that register, most of it does not look that dramatic. Most of it looks like ordinary, human, entirely understandable responses to the specific discomfort of distance from someone you love. Begging, in the context of avoidant dynamics, is any behavior that communicates to the avoidant that you cannot adequately manage the distance they have created, that their withdrawal has produced in you a level of distress that requires their re-engagement to resolve, that you need them to come back more than you need your own dignity in the asking. It is the text sent after the silence has stretched too long that has the specific, slightly breathless quality of someone who could not hold the not reaching. The conversation reopened after the withdrawal by the person who was withdrawn from rather than by the person who withdrew. The softening of a boundary communicated earlier because the discomfort of the boundary not being met has exceeded the discomfort of the boundary being abandoned. The returning to a dynamic that demonstrated its limitations at terms that have not changed because the alternative of not returning was more frightening than the cost of returning unchanged. None of these behaviors are shameful. They are the entirely human responses of someone who loves a person and finds the experience of that person's withdrawal genuinely, physically, emotionally painful. They are what people do when they are attached to someone and that someone creates distance without adequate explanation or resolution. They are the predictable output of a nervous system in the specific distress of threatened attachment. There is no moral failure in them, but they feed the script. They fill the role that the script requires. They give the avoidant the specific information, you need me more than you need your own self-possession, that the script is organized around receiving. And in receiving it, the script continues. The pattern sustains. The dynamic reinstates itself at the same level of imbalance that produced the withdrawal in the first place. You did not beg, and the precise meaning of that, what it actually was, what produced it, what it required of you, deserves careful attention before examining what it produced in the avoidant. Because not begging can mean several different things, and only one of them has the specific quality that breaks the script rather than simply pausing it. Not begging as pride is the refusal to pursue driven by the desire to appear unaffected, by the determination to not give the avoidant the satisfaction of seeing the impact of their withdrawal, by the performance of composure as a form of protection or retaliation. This version is not authentic. It has the avoidant at its center, is organized still around their response, around what the withholding of visible need will produce in them. It is not genuine self-possession. It is managed self-presentation. And avoidants, whose nervous systems are finely calibrated to the difference between real and performed emotional states, tend to feel the performance underneath the composure. The script pauses rather than breaking. They wait with the patience of someone who has seen the performance before and knows it has a duration. Not begging as strategy is the withholding of pursuit as a calculated move to produce a specific reaction. The silence maintained not because it is genuine, but because somewhere you read or were told that not pursuing activates avoidant desire, and you are testing the theory with one eye on the results. This version also has the avoidant at its center, is also organized around their response, is also not authentic self-possession but a different kind of performance. The performance of someone who is not waiting while very actively waiting to see if the not waiting produces the desired outcome. This version also fails to break the script for the same reason. The calculation underneath is readable. The desire is not gone, the orientation is still outward rather than inward. The script pauses, the avoidant waits. Not begging as genuine self-reclamation is the version that breaks the script entirely. It is the not pursuing that arrives when the orientation of your attention has genuinely shifted, not because you decided to shift it as a tactic, not because you are performing detachment in the hope of a specific response, but because something inside you has moved. The threshold of what you will continue to absorb has been reached honestly. The energy that used to flow toward the monitoring and the reaching and the careful management of the dynamic has genuinely, quietly redirected itself toward your own life. The not begging is not about them at all. It is about you, about the version of yourself that is no longer available for the specific dynamic that the begging would sustain, about the genuine, unperformed, cannot be waited out reality of someone who has simply, completely stopped. This version breaks the script, not because it is more clever or more strategically sophisticated than the other versions, because it is real, and real things cannot be managed by the strategies that work on performed things. What happens in the avoidant, when you genuinely do not beg, needs to be walked through with precision, because the sequence matters, and each stage illuminates something important about both the avoidant psychology and the specific power of your not begging. The first stage, as has been discussed in other contexts, but bears examination here from this specific angle, is the waiting. The avoidant withdraws, and then, almost immediately, enters the particular quality of suspended attention that characterizes the period between withdrawal and expected pursuit. They are not fully present in their own life during this period. They are partially attending to the signal, the reaching that the script says should be coming, the text, the call, the reopened conversation, the softened boundary, the evidence of distress that confirms the dynamic is proceeding as expected. This waiting is not usually conscious. The avoidant is not sitting with deliberate awareness, thinking now they will pursue. It is the automatic background scanning of a nervous system that has learned to expect a specific stimulus and is calibrated to receive it. The way your attention sharpens when you are waiting for a sound you expect to hear. Not effort. Orientation. And in this waiting, even before the expected stimulus arrives or fails to arrive, something is happening in the avoidant that the script was designed to prevent them from having to feel. The discomfort of the withdrawal's consequences is present. The absence of the connection they created distance from is registering. The specific, low-level, poorly managed experience of having moved away from something significant and now existing in the space defined by that movement is active in them. And the expected pursuit, the reaching of the person they withdrew from, would, in the ordinary operation of the script, soothe this discomfort, would provide the evidence that the connection is still there, still held by the other person, still available when the avoidant is ready to return to it, would restore the sense of relational security without requiring the avoidant to do the vulnerable, costly work of restoring it themselves. The waiting is, in other words, the avoidant passively depending on your pursuit to manage the discomfort that their withdrawal produced, depending on your distress to regulate their own, using your need as the resource that makes their distance emotionally survivable. The second stage begins when the waiting extends past its expected duration, when the stimulus that the nervous system was calibrated to receive does not arrive on the timeline the script has established, when the reaching does not come in the first day or the first few days or the first week, when the silence from your side is real rather than a brief pause before the inevitable pursuit. In this second stage, the waiting that was passive and background becomes active and front. The partial attention that was scanning for the signal becomes primary attention. The avoidant who was living their life with the background awareness of expecting your pursuit begins to live their life with the foreground awareness of your pursuit not arriving. And the difference between those two experiences is significant in ways that the avoidant was not prepared for. Because the background scanning was not really about you, it was about the regulation of their own discomfort through the assurance of your continued engagement. The foreground awareness of your not pursuing is unavoidably about you, about your actual state, about what your silence means, about whether the model, the one that had your availability as a constant, your need as a reliable feature of the dynamic, your reaching as the dependable beat of the script, was accurate. And the model beginning to feel inaccurate is the beginning of genuine destabilization. The third stage is where the breaking of the script produces its most significant and most revealing effects. It is where the avoidant's interior experience moves from the managed discomfort of waiting into something less manageable and more honest. They begin to question the premise of the dynamic, not in the broad self-reflective, this is a pattern I should examine way, that genuine therapeutic work looks like. In the immediate, practical, slightly panicked way of someone whose operational model has encountered information it cannot process. The question is not the philosophical one about attachment styles and relational patterns. It is the raw, urgent, entirely personal one. Why are they not reaching? And the answers that the avoidant reaches for in response to this question are revelatory. The first answers are defensive. They are playing games, they are giving me a taste of my own medicine, they are performing detachment to see how I respond. These answers preserve the original power dynamic. They position your not begging as a calculated move in a game that the avoidant can see through, which allows the avoidant to maintain the sense of relational literacy and control that the script has always provided. If your not reaching is a strategy, it can be waited out. If it is a performance, it will eventually end. The script pauses, but the underlying structure remains intact. But if the defensive answers do not hold, if the silence extends long enough and carries a quality that is convincingly real rather than performed, the defensive answers give way to something more uncomfortable. To the questions that the script was always designed to prevent the avoidant from having to sit with. Did I go too far this time? Did I miscalculate what they would absorb? Did I assume a level of dependency that was not actually there? Did I take something for granted that was not mine to take for granted? Is this the silence of someone who is done, rather than the silence of someone who is waiting? These questions are genuinely destabilizing, not because they have obvious answers, because they do not. Because the specific unperformable quality of your genuine not begging makes the answers genuinely uncertain in a way that the avoidance management strategies cannot resolve. And genuine uncertainty, particularly the specific variety that involves the real possibility of losing something significant, is the condition under which avoidant defenses are least effective and genuine feeling is most available. The fourth stage is the one that produces what might be called the humbling. Not the humbling that comes from external defeat or visible failure, the internal, private, much more consequential humbling of someone whose self-narrative has encountered undeniable information. The self-narrative of the avoidant, the one that the script was sustaining, carries within it a specific and rarely examined assumption about the power dynamic of the relationship, the assumption that they hold more relational power than the person they are with, that their need for the connection is less than the other person's, that their capacity to manage without the relationship is greater, that the dynamic's continuation is more dependent on their willingness to return than on the other person's willingness to continue holding the space. This assumption, which feels like self-sufficiency and presents itself as emotional strength, is in reality the mechanism by which the avoidant avoids the vulnerability of genuine mutual need. If they need the connection less than you do, they cannot be as hurt by its loss. If the dynamic is more dependent on their return than on your continued availability, they retain the safety of being the one who can always come back to something that will still be there. The assumption is not a conscious strategy. It is the automatic protective positioning of someone whose attachment history taught them that needing more than the other person is the most dangerous position available in a relationship. Your not begging dismantles the assumption, directly, without argument or confrontation or the kind of explicit challenge that the avoidant could engage with defensively, simply by being real, by demonstrating in the most undeniable way available, behavioral evidence over time, that the assumption was wrong, that your need for the connection is not greater than your need for your own dignity and your own peace, that the dynamic's continuation is not more dependent on their return than on your continued availability, that the floor they were standing on was not their own self-sufficiency but your sustained willingness to hold the space, and that you have stopped holding it. The humbling is the experience of the floor giving way, and the understanding, arriving with it, that the floor was never really theirs, that they were standing on something they did not build, and did not maintain, and did not adequately value until it was no longer there. What the avoidant does with this humbling varies, and the variation is the most important thing to understand about the aftermath of your not begging, because it determines what the breaking of the script actually produces in terms of the dynamic's future. Some avoidants, encountering the humbling, move toward it. Use the destabilization as the opening it genuinely is, the crack in the defended architecture through which honest self-examination can finally enter. Sit with the discomfort of the questions, rather than managing them back to a tolerable level. Allow the experience of your not begging to do its full work, which is to bring them into honest contact with the cost of their patterns and the reality of what those patterns nearly lost. And from that honest contact, begin, haltingly, imperfectly, with all the awkwardness of someone doing genuinely unfamiliar emotional work, to move towards something different, toward genuine reaching. Toward the accountable, self-aware, cost-bearing vulnerability of going first without the safety of knowing it will be met. These are the avoidants who are changed by your not begging in ways that are real and lasting rather than temporary and situational, for whom the breaking of the script is the beginning of a different story rather than the same story with a more dramatic arc, for whom your refusal to fill the role the dynamic required produces not the management of their discomfort back to baseline, but the genuine, significant, life-changing confrontation with what the role they assigned you was costing both of you. Other avoidants, encountering the same humbling, move away from it. Find a way to manage the discomfort down to a level that is survivable without requiring the full reckoning the discomfort was pointing toward. Locate enough alternative regulation, enough distraction, enough self-narrative reconstruction, enough routing of the difficult feeling into more manageable channels to restore the equilibrium without the honest accounting that restoring the equilibrium properly would require. File the experience of your not begging as information that will not fundamentally change the operating pattern. Perhaps adjust the calibration slightly. Be somewhat more present, somewhat more attentive to the signals of the other person's engagement, somewhat less confident in the assumption of guaranteed availability, without doing the deeper architectural work that genuine change requires. These are the avoidants who are temporarily activated by your not begging, but not transformed by it, for whom the breaking of the script is a disruption rather than an opening, for whom the humbling produces the urgency of potential loss, rather than the honest self-examination that the urgency was pointing toward. You will be able to tell the difference, not immediately, in what follows. In whether the reaching that your not begging eventually produces carries the specific, uncomfortable, unglamorous quality of someone who is doing genuine work, or the temporarily activated, urgency-driven, passion-rich but substance-poor quality of someone managing the discomfort of potential loss back to a comfortable level. Now, the most important part, not what your not begging did to the avoidant, what it did for you. Because the not begging was never primarily about them. It was not a move calculated to produce a specific response. It was not a strategy deployed in the service of the dynamic. It was, if it was genuine, if it had the quality of real self-reclamation rather than performed detachment, the first fully self-directed act of a person who had been organizing their emotional life around someone else's patterns for long enough that the organizing had become invisible, had become simply the texture of daily existence, had become so normalized that the question of what your days would feel like if they were not structured around the dynamic was not even available as a question. The not begging made the question available. It opened the space, in your attention, in your energy, in the basic orientation of your moment-to-moment experience, for a different answer to emerge. For the version of yourself that exists when you are not monitoring and absorbing and reaching and waiting to become more visible, more familiar, more recognizably yours. This version of yourself did not disappear during the dynamic. It was not erased or replaced. It was crowded, pushed to the periphery by the gravitational pull of the avoidance patterns on your attention and your energy and your sense of what the primary concern of any given day was. And the not begging, by withdrawing your participation from the dynamic that was doing the crowding, created the conditions for the uncrowding to begin. The uncrowding is not a single event. It is the gradual, daily, often unspectacular process of reclaiming the space that the dynamic occupied. It shows up in small ways before it shows up in large ones. In the morning that begins with your own thought, rather than with the low hum of the dynamic. In the hour that passes without the background processing of where the avoidant is and what their silence means, and whether today is the day the script advances to the next beat, in the decision made from genuine preference rather than from the calibration of what the dynamic can support, in the moment of genuine, unmonitored, completely present enjoyment of something that is entirely yours and requires nothing from the avoidant's participation to be real, these moments accumulate. They build on each other. They create, over time, the specific and increasingly familiar experience of a life that has its own momentum rather than a life that is waiting for someone else's movement to determine its direction. And that experience, the experience of genuine self-direction, of days that belong to you, of a self that is not primarily defined by its relationship to someone else's patterns, is not available at the beginning of the not begging. It is the product of the not begging's continuation, of the sustained, honest, genuine choice to remain self-directed rather than returning to the monitoring as soon as the discomfort of the not monitoring becomes acute. The discomfort will become acute. This needs to be said plainly because the romantic narrative of self-reclamation tends to present the choosing of yourself as immediately and consistently rewarding. As though the moment you stop begging and start living your own life, the relief is clean and the peace is present, and the pulling back toward the dynamic is manageable and occasional. It is not always like that. Some days the not begging feels like exactly what it is, the dignified, self-respecting, genuinely healthy choice of someone who finally decided they were worth choosing. And some days it feels like deprivation, like sitting with a hunger that has not been fed and that is not yet convinced that the hunger is the path to something better than the insufficient food that was available before. Some days the love that you still carry, and if the connection was real, you carry it. You do not simply stop carrying it because the dynamic demonstrated its limitations, is louder than the clarity, louder than the knowing, louder than the accumulated self-knowledge that produced the not begging in the first place. On those days, the not begging is not a feeling, it is a choice. Made again, on that specific day, against the specific pull of what would be easier. And made not because it feels good, but because you know, in the deep bodily, experientially grounded way, that genuine knowing lives. That returning to the begging is returning to the role. And the role, however familiar, however briefly soothing, produces the same dynamic, the same script, the same imbalance, the same gradual erosion of the version of yourself that the not begging was built to restore. On those days, the not begging is the act of love directed at yourself, that the dynamic never quite allowed. The specific, demanding, unglamorous form of self-care that is not comfortable or immediately rewarding, but is the only thing that actually builds the ground rather than borrowing it. Here is what the avoidant who waited for you to beg and then watched you not beg is left with in the honest accounting of what your not begging produced in them, if the connection was genuine and the feeling was real. They are left with a specific, private, often unacknowledged experience of having encountered someone who valued themselves more than they valued the continuity of the dynamic. Someone for whom the cost of the role was eventually greater than the cost of the silence. Someone who demonstrated, without announcement and without drama, that their presence in the connection was a choice rather than a given, that it was something being offered rather than something that could be assumed, that the floor was theirs to give and theirs to withdraw. This experience does not leave the avoidant unchanged. Even the avoidants who manage the humbling back to a comfortable level rather than allowing it to produce genuine reckoning, even those avoidants are different in some specific and permanent way for having encountered someone who did not beg. The model is updated. The assumption of guaranteed availability is revised, at least partially. The experience of the script breaking creates a new data point in the avoidance relational history, the data point of someone who held their ground when the ground holding was genuinely costly. And that data point, even when it does not produce immediate and visible change, is filed somewhere in the nervous system as information about what is possible, about what a person who values themselves looks like in the specific conditions of an avoidant dynamic. It is the data point of you, of the version of you that the not begging revealed. Not the version that was absorbing and adjusting and reaching and performing the careful calibration of someone trying to make themselves compatible with a pattern that was never compatible with them. The version that exists when the performance is over. The version that is simply, completely, without apology or modification, yourself. That version of you is the most important outcome of the not begging, more important than what it produced in the avoidant, more significant than whether the script broke in a way that led to genuine change, or in a way that was managed back to familiar patterns, more lasting than any single dynamic or any single relationship. It is the version of you that knows, experientially rather than theoretically, that you can hold your own ground in the specific and challenging conditions of loving someone whose patterns push directly on your attachment fears. That you can feel the pull toward the begging, the genuine human, entirely understandable pull of wanting the distance to close and the connection to restore. And choose, against that pull, something more self-respecting. That the love you carry for someone does not have to produce the surrender of your own dignity in order to be genuine. This knowledge is yours permanently, not because the not begging was always easy, because it was often not easy and you did it anyway, because the choice was made in conditions that were genuinely difficult, against a pull that was genuinely powerful, for a reason that was genuinely about you rather than about managing someone else's emotional weather. You waited for yourself instead of begging for them. You chose the version of the story in which your self-possession was the constant rather than the variable, in which your dignity was not the thing being offered in exchange for their re-engagement, in which the script that required your need to sustain it ran out of the fuel it needed because you stopped providing the fuel. And in that stopping, in the quiet, unglamorous daily act of simply not begging, you became something that the dynamic was never designed to produce and could never have given you. You became the person who does not beg, not as a performance, not as a strategy, as the simple, permanent, entirely true expression of someone who finally, completely understood that love worth having does not require the surrender of the self it is being offered by. That is who you are now. And that is the thing the avoidant waited for that never came. The begging that would have told them the script was still running. The need that would have confirmed the dynamic was still organized around their return as its primary variable. It never came. And in the not coming, something that was more valuable than anything the script could have produced arrived instead. You, whole, standing on your own ground, requiring nothing from their return to be complete. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Everything is a word that gets used carelessly in the language of emotional transformation, as though the arrival at a place of genuine self-possession is a final destination rather than a living condition that requires daily inhabiting. As though the person who finally stopped begging woke up the next morning entirely free of the pull toward the dynamic, entirely comfortable in the new orientation, entirely at peace with the specific costs of the choice they made. As though everything, once found, stays found without the ongoing work of returning to it. The truth is less cinematic and more durable. The everything that the not begging produces is not a state. It is a capacity. The capacity to return to yourself when the pull away from yourself becomes strong. To recognize the pull for what it is, not a signal that the not begging was wrong, or that the self-reclamation was premature, or that the love you still carry is evidence that you should have stayed in the role, but simply the natural, human, entirely predictable pull of an attachment system that was wired to a specific person in a specific dynamic and is not yet fully rewired to the absence of it. The capacity to feel that pull and not follow it is not something you either have or do not have. It is something you build. Interaction by interaction. Day by day. Choice by unglamorous choice. In the ordinary, unwitnessed, unremarkable moments when the phone is in your hand and the impulse to reach is present, and you put the phone down not because the reaching would be wrong, but because the reaching would be the beginning of the begging, the beginning of the return to the role, the beginning of the script resuming at the exact page where it was paused, because the script does not care how long the pause was. It picks up where it left off. It offers the familiar warmth of the known dynamic as the reward for filling the role again. And some part of you will want that warmth, will recognize it as genuinely real, genuinely comforting, genuinely preferable in the short term to the specific discomfort of the new orientation. Some part of you will argue, in the quiet and persuasive voice of something that knows you well, that the dynamic was not only its limitations, that the best moments were real, that the connection had a specific quality that the general project of moving on cannot replicate, because it was specific. It was that person, that particular resonance, that unrepeatable combination of recognition and difficulty and genuine depth that made the whole insufficient thing worth staying in as long as you did. That part of you is not wrong. The best moments were real. The connection did have a specific quality. The resonance was genuine. And none of that is a reason to return to a dynamic that has demonstrated its inability to sustain what the best moments pointed toward. Both things are true simultaneously. the realness of what was best, and the insufficiency of what was consistent, the genuine value of the connection and the genuine cost of the role it required you to occupy. Holding both without letting one cancel the other, without using the realness of the best moments as permission to forget the cost of the consistent ones, that is the work. Ongoing, daily, sometimes exhausting work. But work that builds something which is more than the dynamic was ever able to do. There is a specific phase that tends to occur in the weeks or months after the not begging has been sustained long enough to be real, long enough that the avoidant has genuinely encountered its quality as something other than a pause, before the inevitable pursuit. That deserves careful attention. Because it is the phase in which the most important and the most easily misread things tend to happen. It is the phase of the avoidance response to your not begging becoming visible. Not always visible in the direct, declared, I finally understand what I lost way that the hope in you might want it to look like. More often visible in the indirect, oblique, avoidant characteristic ways that feeling in defended people tends to find expression when the direct channel is too exposed to use. The sudden reappearance after extended silence. The contact that arrives with a quality of casual brightness that is slightly too deliberate to be casual. The reaching that is wrapped in something other than its actual motivation. A question, a reference to something shared, a comment on something neutral, because the actual motivation is too exposed to be sent without cover. This response, when it comes, will feel significant. Because it is significant, it is the evidence that the not begging landed, that the breaking of the script produced the effect in the avoidant that the genuine version of it always produces. The destabilization of the assumption, the humbling of the self-narrative, the activation of genuine feeling through the specific mechanism of genuine uncertainty about whether the feeling still has somewhere to go. And in the feeling of significance, the pull toward the begging will reassert itself in a new form. Not the original begging, not the reaching from distress, the pursuing from need, the visible evidence of dependency that the script was designed to extract. A more sophisticated form of the same impulse, the impulse to respond to their reaching with the full, warm, immediately available version of yourself that makes the reconnection as easy and as low cost for them as possible. The impulse to smooth the return, to meet their tentative, cautious, still defended reaching with the generous, encompassing warmth of someone who has been waiting and is relieved that the waiting is ending. This impulse is understandable. It is also, in the specific context of what the not begging was building, the most important one to examine before acting on. Because responding to their reaching with the immediately available cost-reducing version of yourself is a form of begging in reverse. It is communicating, through the quality of your response, that the waiting is over and the door is fully open and the previous configuration is available to resume. That the not begging was a pause rather than a permanent shift in how you hold yourself in relation to the dynamic. The response that honors what the not begging built is different. It is warm but not immediately encompassing. Present but not immediately fully available. Genuinely pleased to hear from them, if that is true, without the pleasure being of the specific quality that communicates relief. The relief of someone who has been waiting, rather than the natural, measured warmth of someone who has been living their own life and is glad to have an interaction but does not require it. This distinction matters enormously, not because you are playing games, because you are communicating something true. The true thing being communicated is that the configuration has changed. That the person on the other side of the dynamic is not the same person who was absorbing and adjusting and reaching from a position of greater need. That the terms of any re-engagement are different from the terms that the previous dynamic was operating on, not as a declared ultimatum, as the simply visible reality of someone who is no longer in the role. When the avoidant encounters this version of you, the version that responds with genuine warmth but without the immediately available fullness that the old role provided, something happens in them that is worth understanding. They encounter something unfamiliar in the specific relational context of you. They encounter someone they know, someone whose voice and energy and particular quality of presence is deeply familiar, operating from a position they have not previously experienced from you. A position of genuine equilibrium, of even-handedness, of being truly pleased to hear from them without that pleasure having the undertow of relief and need that the previous configuration always carried. And this unfamiliarity, this encounter with the version of you that the not begging produced, is more activating than almost anything else available in the dynamic. Not activating in the anxious, this might be lost way that the silence activated. Activating in the specific, quietly compelling way of encountering a person who surprises you, who does not behave as the model predicted, who is recognizably themselves and yet different in a way that makes the familiar feel newly interesting, who has, in the time of the silence, become more fully themselves in a way that is visible without being declared. This activation is the avoidance desire encountering its optimal conditions, not the urgency of potential loss. The draw of genuine substance, the pull towards someone who is clearly, visibly living their own life and offering access to that life rather than waiting for the avoidance participation to make the life worth living. Someone whose availability is real but not unconditional, whose warmth is genuine but not reflexive, whose presence communicates interest without communicating need. This is the person the not begging built. And this person is genuinely, specifically different from the person the avoidant was relating to before the silence. The difference is not performed. It cannot be performed. It is the natural expression of someone who has done the actual internal work of reclaiming themselves, and the work shows, not as a presentation, but as a quality. As the specific unperformable quality of someone who is actually okay, rather than managing toward okay. The avoidance desire for this version of you is different in kind from the desire that the urgent, passionate, script-breaking ignition produces. It does not have the same urgency. It is not driven by the specific activation of potential loss. It is slower, more considered, less immediately consuming, and more persistently present. It is the desire that builds rather than the desire that explodes. The kind that is sustainable rather than the kind that peaks and normalizes. The kind that, under the right conditions and with the right internal work from both people, is the foundation of something that is not the dynamic you had before. But, and this requires being said with the directness it deserves, the desire for the new version of you does not automatically come with the capacity to meet the new version of you properly. The avoidant who encounters the person you have become and feels drawn toward that person is still the avoidant whose patterns produced the original hurt and the subsequent hiding and the waiting for the begging that never came. The desire is updated. The patterns are not automatically updated with it. And desire without the updated patterns is the beginning of the same story with a more attractive opening chapter. The question that matters, when the avoidant responds to the version of you the not begging built, is not whether the desire is genuine, it is whether the desire is accompanied by the genuine, behavioral, over time visible evidence of someone whose patterns are actually shifting. Whose reaching continues after the urgency normalizes. Whose accountability arrives in the specific, costly, unglamorous form of real accountability rather than the smooth, warmth-forward form of managed remorse. Whose presence in the ordinary days, the days when nothing is dramatic, where nothing is at stake, when the dynamic is not being tested by crisis or distance, or the activated passion of potential loss, is consistent and real and demonstrably chosen rather than defaulted to. That evidence is the only evidence that matters. Not the quality of the initial reaching, not the warmth of the reconnection, not the genuine activated desire that the new version of you produced. The consistent, ordinary, day after day evidence of someone who is showing up differently. Because differently is the only configuration in which the dynamic becomes something other than what it was. Something needs to be said about the people who will never see the version of you that the not begging built. The people for whom the avoidant who waited and was not met with begging will remain, in some privately held version of the story, the person who simply did not care enough to fight for the connection. Who will reconstruct the dynamic in the comfortable narrative that positions their own patterns as the understandable backdrop and your not begging as the surprising variable, as something you did rather than something that was always available in you, and that the dynamic's demands were simply preventing from being expressed. This reconstruction will happen in some cases, and knowing that it might happen, that the not begging may not produce the honest reckoning in the avoidant that it has the potential to produce, is part of holding the not begging as genuinely self-directed rather than outcome-dependent. Because the not begging was always at its most fundamental for you. It was the act of someone who decided that their own self-possession was worth more than the continuation of the role. And the value of that decision does not depend on the avoidant understanding it correctly. Does not depend on the avoidant being changed by it in a specific way that would make the dynamic's potential the thing it could be. Does not depend on anything the avoidant does or does not do with the experience of being met with silence, where the script required begging. The value is intrinsic. It exists in what the not begging produced in you, in the version of yourself that was recovered, in the capacity built, in the ground found, In the permanent, experience-grounded knowledge of what you are capable of when the love you carry for someone does not override the love you carry for yourself. There is one more thing that deserves to be said about the avoidant who waited for you to beg and watched you not beg, and it is the thing that tends to be most quietly present in the private interior of someone who has genuinely been through this dynamic and arrived at the place the not begging was pointing toward. The avoidant who waited will eventually, if the connection was genuine and the feeling was real, have a moment of honest reckoning with what they were waiting for. Not necessarily immediately, not necessarily in a form that they will share with you or that you will ever have visibility into. But the moment will come. In the dark, in the specific honest hours when the defenses are tired and the management strategies have run their course, when the waiting is seen clearly for what it was. They were waiting for you to demonstrate that they were worth begging for, that the connection mattered enough to you that your dignity was the lower priority consideration, that their withdrawal had produced in you the specific, visible, emotionally unguarded distress that would confirm what the core wound has always needed to hear, that you cannot manage without them, that they are necessary in the particular, irreplaceable, fundamental way that the core wound is not sure they are worthy of being. The not begging denied them that confirmation, and the denial of it, the simple, sustained, entirely undramatic reality of someone who did not beg, is, in the honest midnight accounting, the most significant thing that could have happened to the avoidant psychology. Because the confirmation they were waiting for would have told them nothing new, would have reinstated the dynamic and sustained the pattern and left the core wound exactly as it was, hungry for the confirmation, receiving it, briefly soothed, waiting for the next withdrawal to produce the next confirmation in the next cycle of the same insufficient story. But the not begging told them something they had not heard before, in the language that the nervous system actually processes, rather than the language of words that the intellect manages and routes around. It told them that someone who genuinely saw them, who knew them, who loved them, who had been present with the full complicated reality of who they are, had decided that the role the dynamic required was not compatible with the person they were outside of it. That the love was real, and the limit was also real, and that the limit, for once, was louder than the love's pulling toward accommodation. That is not nothing. That is not a small or casual or easily processed thing. That is the most direct and most undeniable communication available about the true cost of the avoidant pattern. Not communicated in anger or in the explicit declaration of someone who has finally reached their limit and is naming it loudly. Communicated in the quiet, sustained, completely honest form of someone who simply stopped, who let the silence be what it was, who did not fill it with the begging the script required and in the not filling revealed, without a word, the full weight of what the dynamic had been asking of them all along. The avoidant who receives that communication and allows it to land, who sits with it rather than managing it, who lets it do its full work rather than filing it as one more piece of information to be contextualized, has been given the specific gift that genuine love in its most honest form can offer. Not the comfortable gift of the begging that would have confirmed the comfortable story, the uncomfortable, destabilizing, potentially transformative gift of someone choosing themselves over the script. That gift is yours to have given, regardless of what they do with it, regardless of whether it produces the change it points toward, or whether it is managed back to a comfortable level and filed among the things that happened, but were not allowed to be transformative. You gave it. In the specific, costly, unglamorous form of simply not begging, of choosing yourself when choosing yourself was genuinely hard and genuinely costly, and required the daily, repeated choosing that real self-possession always requires. That is not a small thing. It is, in the honest accounting of what is difficult and what is valuable in relational life, one of the most significant things you can offer. To yourself, first. And then, by the simple and unstoppable truth of what genuine self-possession produces in the people who encounter it, to them, the script broke. The role was vacated. The begging never came, and in its not coming, the most important story of this whole dynamic finally had space to begin. Yours, with yourself as its primary character, without apology, without the role, without the begging that was never, not for a single moment, something you owed. You already knew that, now you lived it. And the living of it is the most unassailable form of knowing available. It is yours. Completely, permanently. No avoidance waiting, however long, can take it back.